For decades, the idea of a carbon tax has been stuck in the waiting room of American politics. It's familiar to pretty much everybody, but it sat there long enough to grow cobwebs and collect dust. For the vast majority of Republicans, the idea is really bad. And for Democrats, it's one of among several policies that compete for the love of lawmakers and climate politicians. But politics, like the climate, is volatile these days. In the past couple of years, some Republicans have broken ranks with their party to support a tax on carbon emissions because the climate is starting to become more important among voters. Perhaps as kind of a way to break against the more radical Green New Deal folks, or perhaps to some, trying to do something to stop global warming is kind of important. So given that tiny bump in bipartisan momentum, it's worth kind of coming back and revisiting the case for a really good carbon tax. So if you want to discourage really bad behaviors, economists say make them expensive. That strategy that we've got works for cigarettes, soda, and gasoline. And it also works for carbon emissions. If we can add a charge to the carbon content of fossil fuels, it's widely seen as one of the most powerful tools a country can use to shrink its emissions. How on earth does it work? Well, it works like this. Government charges a fee per ton of greenhouse gas emitted. The fee is pretty small at first, rising gradually to give companies a chance to adapt. Individual households don't get taxed directly, but they could take a hit when the big emitters raise their rates and their prices in response. The beauty of a carbon tax is that everything we want consumers to do gets incentivized to finally be done. Residents start to pay more attention to their thermostats because it costs more. Utilities might invest more in solar or wind farms. Manufacturers could start to offer more energy-saving products, like more efficient cars and heating and air conditioning systems. Several countries have started some form of carbon pricing, just not the really bad nations. After Sweden started a tax in 1991, its transportation emissions fell an average of 6% every single year. Now, a separate tax on transport fuels shrank the country's carbon footprint even more. Over in British Columbia, a carbon tax reduced emissions by up to 15%. Last year, after the province in Canada experiment worked and became successful, Canada expanded carbon pricing nationwide. Researchers at MIT have calculated that the U.S. placed a $50 per ton tax on carbon and increased the tax 5% every single year. Emissions would drop 63% by 2050. If every country adopted a carbon tax with similar effect, the world might be able to slash its emissions in half by the middle of this century. Now, a U.S. tax credit for carbon storage that was passed in 2018 could spur the retrofits of carbon plants that would in turn capture 54 million tons of carbon by 2030. That's equivalent of taking like 10 million cars off the streets. The idea that has been taken off and has gotten popular among certain conservatives is one that taxes the badness of a carbon tax, that cuts the negative ramifications of a carbon tax and adds in some sweeteners. U.S. Representatives Francis Rooney, a Florida Republican, has co-sponsored legislation that would impose a fee on metric tons of carbon emitted and then distribute the spoils back to U.S. residents as a monthly carbon dividend. You can think of it as a form of basic income, something that Andrew Yang was talking about. Now, in one proposal, crafted by the Bipartisan Climate Leadership Council, a family of four might expect to get $2,000 back in the first year. Plans put forward by Rooney and the Climate Leadership Council also propose to eliminate or suspend federal regulations on carbon emissions, which could help explain why they have the support of oil giants, car manufacturers, and utility companies. Now, ultimately, a carbon tax needs to be global to reach its full potential. After all, heavily emitted industries can flee to nations that have no taxes or carbon pricing. Placing a carbon tariff on goods imported from those places can incentivize dirty countries to clean up their act. The European Union is now considering some type of measure like that. Revenue from that kind of tariff could again help fund a dividend to shield people from rising costs. Now, those are all good ideas, but they're not too likely to pass during the current U.S. administration. They've pushed tax cuts and denied the severity of climate change. There are campaigns to implement carbon taxes in Washington state, but they failed twice. There are a lot of other options. Mark Jaccard, an economist who helped design British Columbia's carbon tax, argues that country can tighten regulations instead, choosing to phase out coal plants, for example, or to implement a low-carbon fuel standard. Regulations might be way better politically, way better, and only slightly less efficient economically. So the key to saving the world is really going to be in politics.